So, good morning, everyone. And so, as I mentioned the other day, this class that you'll be watching on Wednesday mornings, I'm going to be teaching the 4 establishments of mindfulness, or they're also called the 4 foundations of mindfulness, Satipatana. So you've probably heard of these before. I think Venerable Yunten taught them, and maybe on your own in reading, maybe you've done some retreats on these. But it doesn't hurt to hear about them again. And I'm not just going to be talking about them, but we're going to be doing meditations on them as we go along so that we get a better understanding of them. So before we get into the class, let's take a few minutes to settle down and generate a positive state of mind, a positive motivation. So sit comfortably, relax your body, let go of any tension. And let go of or put aside any thoughts there may be in your mind that aren't related to what we're doing right now. You can always pick them up again later, but decide that for now, for this period of time, you will just keep your mind in the present, focused on the material we're learning in this class, and putting aside any other thoughts that might come up in your mind. And then let's generate a positive motivation. So you can recall the motivation you generated earlier at the beginning of the meditation class. Feeling as much compassion and love as you are capable of for as many people and living beings that you can feel those for. And really feel a wish to be of benefit to others as much as you can. And feel the wish that you will learn something in this class that will enable you to be more beneficial to others, to bring more peace and happiness and well-being to other people and other beings all around the world. So I'll begin by giving some basic information about the 4 foundations of mindfulness, 4 establishments of mindfulness, and then we'll do a little bit of practice of them. So these practices are found in both the Pali tradition, which is the tradition of Buddhism existing in countries like Thailand and Burma, Southeast Asia, They're also found in the Sanskrit tradition. That's the Mahayana tradition that is found in Tibet and China and Japan and so forth. And it seems that in the Theravada tradition in Southeast Asia, they are considered very, very important, and their practice is quite widespread. It's one of the most important practices that both monks and nuns and lay people engage in. And they are also part of the Bodhisattva's path. So in the Mahayana tradition, like in Tibet, China, and so forth, we aspire to follow the Bodhisattva's path and reach full awakening, full enlightenment. And the 4 foundations of mindfulness are meant to be practiced by bodhisattvas as well. However, you don't hear so much about them in the Tibetan tradition. And so it sounds like they're not really being practiced very much. And in fact, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in one of the books I read recently, says that he's disappointed that contemporary practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism are not practicing these 4 establishments of mindfulness. They're actually included within a set of practices that are called the 37 Harmonies with Awakening. So this is a set of 37 different practices that, whether you want to attain nirvana, liberation from suffering, or you want to attain enlightenment, Buddhahood, you need to do these 37 practices. And the first 4 of these 37 are these 4 foundations of mindfulness. So although they are required for bodhisattvas, there seems to be a lack of people who are actually practicing them. So it's good that we are looking at these and learning about these practices to try to keep them alive, revive them, make them part of our practice. And so as resource material for this class on the 4 establishments of mindfulness, I'm using a number of different books. One of them is this book, which was just published recently. The title of this book is Following in the Buddha's Footsteps, and it's volume 4 of a series of books called The Library of Wisdom and Compassion. And it contains teachings by the Dalai Lama, and Venerable Thupten Chodron is the editor of these books. And I've actually been helping with them as well, doing some checking and proofreading and so on. So I'm just very, very impressed with these books because they contain a wealth of wonderful information about the Buddhist path. So in this particular volume, volume 4, Following in the Buddha's Footsteps, there's a very extensive explanation of the 4 establishments of mindfulness, and it actually combines both the Pali tradition and the Sanskrit tradition. So it contains elements from both of those traditions. But I thought that we'll start with the Pali way of explaining these 4 because it's somewhat more basic and easy to practice. The way they're explained in the Sanskrit tradition is somewhat more complicated, perhaps more difficult to practice. And so we'll start with the Pali way, and then later move on to the other way. And so in the book that you have, the book of materials for this course, there's a section on the 4 establishments of mindfulness starting on page 41. And so that contains many of the main points that we're going to be covering. But I will also be bringing in additional material. So much of what you have in your book was extracted from this book, plus, from other sources as well. So you might want to open your book to page 41. I'm going to read that section, and I'll also explains some additional material. So on page 41, it starts with introduction, and in brackets it says FBF. FBF means this book, just for short, following in the Buddha's footsteps. Okay, so this paragraph, or these several paragraphs, are extracted from this book. So it starts off by talking about the purpose of these practices. Why do we do these 4 practices? So it says the purpose of the 4 establishments of mindfulness, which is called Satipatana in Pali, is to gain insight into the nature of our body and mind, and to use this insight to eliminate the mental afflictions that bind us to cyclic existence. So that's the purpose of doing these practices, is to gain insight, or we could also call it wisdom, into the true nature of things, how things actually exist, in particular our own body and mind. The very first object with which we practice the 4 establishments of mindfulness is our body. Okay, so that's the first way of doing this practice. And we tend to not see our body and mind in a correct way. We tend to have mistaken ideas, mistaken conceptions about our body and mind. And these mistaken conceptions can lead to suffering and problems and the perpetuation of our being in cyclic existence, this situation of suffering. And so the purpose of doing these practices is to clear away misconceptions, misunderstandings about our own body and mind, and see them as they are, see them correctly. And in that way, we'll be able to clear up these problems, free ourselves from these problems. So it goes on to say, that is, through realizing the body and mind as impermanent, that's anicca in Pali, unsatisfactory, dukkha. So that's what I was talking about in Monday's class, dukkha. Dukkha is the both Pali and Sanskrit term that is sometimes translated as suffering, but the word suffering isn't so ideal because it usually connotes really terrible experiences, whereas dukkha can include all kinds of unpleasant, unsatisfactory, unwanted experiences. So I'll try to use that term more than suffering. Or another term is unsatisfactory in English, just saying that things are unsatisfactory. And then not self, or anatta. So those 3 things, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self, or non-self, or selflessness, those 3 things are called the 3 marks of existence in the Pali tradition. They're included in the Sanskrit tradition as well, but in the Pali tradition it's very emphasized that we try to understand those 3 things. How, like our body, for example, how it is impermanent, changing all the time, subject to decay and eventually dying. And how our body and so forth are unsatisfactory because they don't last. I mean, whatever is impermanent, whatever is going to last, cannot be truly satisfying because it's only going to be there for a limited amount of time. So we cannot get lasting happiness and satisfaction from it. And then not self. So that's the most difficult one, to understand that there's no real, solid, permanent, fixed self or I anywhere within our body and mind. Even though we tend to believe there's such a self and we grasp at such a self, but when we look for it and try to find it, we can't find it. So anyway, those 3 things are the things that we're trying to understand by doing these practices of the 4 establishments of mindfulness. And so it goes on to say, so by realizing the body and mind as impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self, we want to eliminate the ignorance, the craving, and the grasping, and the other afflictive emotions that keep propelling us into suffering states again and again. So that's the real purpose. The real purpose is to free ourselves from suffering, this whole cycle of samsara, dying and being reborn and going through painful experiences again and again and again. So I think that this topic, the subject of the 4 establishments of mindfulness, is a good complement to the main topic that you're learning about this semester, which is learning about the different kinds of suffering or dukkha and its causes, ignorance, the other afflictions, and how to start to overcome these causes of suffering. So this is the method. This is one of the methods, one of the main methods for doing just that. And so then it goes on to say, to gain this insight into those 3 marks of existence, developing sharp mindfulness and deep concentration are necessary. And the practice of the 4 establishments of mindfulness accomplishes these as well. So these practices, the 4 foundations, are mainly to cultivate insight or wisdom, but they also help us to develop concentration and mindfulness. So those are also very important tools, mental states, both for our present happiness and peace and also more long-term happiness and peace. And next it explains the term establishments of mindfulness. So these 4 are called establishments of mindfulness because they set up or establish mindfulness. They concern not only the object of mindfulness, but also the way mindfulness of these 4 objects is established. So that's the purpose, is to establish, to develop, to cultivate mindfulness in relation to these 4 objects. And the 4 objects are the body, feelings, the mind, and all phenomena. So we'll go through those one by one, starting with the body. Okay, so then the next sentence says, mindfulness, introspective awareness, and wisdom are essential components of Dharma practice. So let's pause there because I want to explain these terms, especially mindfulness. There's a lot of different ideas about what is mindfulness. It's become a big thing in the West. There's even magazines and apps and all kinds of ways that people can learn and practice mindfulness. And one of the first programs to bring mindfulness from Buddhism into kind of mainstream society was the mindfulness-based stress reduction program started by Jon Kabat-Zinn. I don't know when that was, 30, 40 years ago. And so that's become quite a big program. And I think it's wonderful because they're teaching mindfulness to people suffering from different kinds of problems, such as pain, physical pain, chronic pain, sleep disorders, eating disorders, as well as different kinds of emotional problems like depression, stress, and so forth. And it's found to be very helpful, very effective in dealing with these problems. So it's bringing a lot of benefit to a lot of people. And in that program, in that tradition, mindfulness is usually explained as something like being aware of what is happening in the present moment in a non-judgmental way. So it's just paying attention to what's happening moment by moment without judging, without liking and disliking, this is good, this is bad. So this kind of practice is definitely very helpful. A lot of people have been benefited by it. And it's a practice that is derived from Buddhism, but it's not the whole of Buddhism. I think this is a mistake that people sometimes have, that Buddhism is nothing but mindfulness, that kind of mindfulness. So they've sort of extracted this practice of mindfulness from Buddhism, which is a very vast and rich tradition. And then many people think that's all there is to Buddhism. There's nothing else, but there is a lot more, as you know by now. So I'd like to explain the term mindfulness in Buddhism, but here it's also kind of complex, because there's the word mindfulness is used in different ways in different contexts. So it's not so simple and straightforward that there's only one meaning of mindfulness that's always exactly the same in every situation. So one of the main meanings of mindfulness is that it's a mental factor. And I think you've already studied the mental factors, so you might remember that or go back to your notes about that. So mindfulness is a mental factor, meaning that it is one aspect of our experience. It's probably not always there, but sometimes it's there. And the mental factor, mindfulness, is said to have three features. One is the object. The object of mindfulness is something familiar, something we already know, we're already familiar with. It's not a new object, a brand new object that we've never experienced before. It's something we know, something familiar. And the second feature is non-forgetfulness. So when there's mindfulness, mindfulness is present on an object, again, a familiar object. Mindfulness stays with that object or holds on to that object, doesn't forget it, doesn't lose it. Although after a few seconds, it might lose it. But for a few seconds, if we are able to stay with that object, that means there's mindfulness. And then the third feature is like the function of mindfulness. What does mindfulness do? It prevents the mind from being distracted to other things, to other objects. So let's just take an example to understand what mindfulness is and how it works. So when we practice meditation on the breathing, so the breath is the object when we're doing that practice. And the breath is a familiar object. Right? We're familiar with the breath. It's not something brand new. We've been breathing since we came out of our mother's womb. So we know the breath very well. So the breath is the object, and it's a familiar object. So that fulfills the first feature. So when we are able to stay on the breath, focused on the breath, even if it's just a few seconds, then that means we have mindfulness. So for those few seconds that we are able to remember the breath and hold the breath, stay on the breath, then that shows mindfulness is present. But sooner or later, we get distracted. We've kind of lose the breath, forget the breath, and we're off thinking about something else. So when that happens, when our mind has been distracted, that means we've lost mindfulness. Mindfulness has kind of collapsed. But not forever. We can re-energize it. We can bring it back. So if we realize we've become distracted and say, no, I'm supposed to watch the breath. So then we return our attention to the breath, and then we stay with the breath for another few seconds or maybe a few minutes. So as long as we are staying with our object, like the breath in that case, then that shows mindfulness is present. Mindfulness is there. And it's mindfulness that's holding the mind to the breath, not forgetting it, not being distracted to other things. So if you think of your own experience, look at your own experience, then you can recognize mindfulness when those features are present. So that's the general meaning of mindfulness as a mental factor. And the word mindfulness is also used in other ways as well. For example, those of us who are monastics, monks and nuns, we have precepts. Also lay people. Lay people who are not monks and nuns but want to be a Buddhist, and they take refuge, and they sometimes take precepts. For example, they make the vow to not kill, to not steal, and so forth. And this is a promise that we make for the rest of our life. So it's quite a serious thing. So having taken precepts, or even just one precept, you need to be mindful of that. You need to remember that you took that vow and not forget it. Because if, one day you go through a ceremony and you promise to the Buddha, I promise that I will not kill. So you probably feel very serious at that moment and really sincere and really committed to following that practice. But you have to remember that the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day and so on. So that even if, maybe in the past you used to swat mosquitoes. If mosquitoes landed on your skin, you would just go. And so you have to remember, you took a precept to not kill. So you can't do that anymore. So if you don't have mindfulness, then there's the danger of forgetting that you made that promise, that you took that precept, that vow, and then breaking it. So we are advised to practice mindfulness with regard to our vows and our precepts so that we don't break them. We have to remember what precepts we made or took and remember to keep them. So that's another way in which the term mindfulness is used. And again, it has this sense of remembering and not forgetting, remembering what we have promised to do. And in your work as therapists, you have clients or patients, and you're supposed to meet them at certain times in certain places. So you have to remember that. If you forget, then it can cause a lot of distress to your patients. So there's lots of ways in which mindfulness plays an important role in our life. Remembering what responsibilities we have, what commitments we have, what promises we've made, so that we don't break those, we don't lose those. Okay, so now in the context of these four establishments of mindfulness, the meaning of mindfulness here has a somewhat different meaning. So it still means keeping the mind on an object. So, for example, the breath, if we're doing meditation on the breath, mindfulness keeps our mind focused on the breath. But in addition to that, it also needs to be combined with wisdom that understands the objects. So, just a sentence from the book says, establishing mindfulness means to place our mindfulness on an object comprehended by wisdom. And when I read that, I thought, well, does that mean we have to have wisdom first before we can do these practices of the four foundations of mindfulness? Somehow I don't think that is correct. But rather, I think by doing these practices, engaging in these four practices of mindfulness, we develop wisdom. And then once we have that wisdom, for example, understanding that our body is impermanent, that it's unsatisfactory, and eventually that it's empty of a self, then when we have mindfulness of our body, we're doing it together with that understanding, together with that wisdom. But anyway, the point is, it's not, in the context of these practices, it's not just being aware of what's happening in the moment, but doing so combined with wisdom, wisdom that understands the real nature of the object that we're meditating on. So that's a little bit about mindfulness, and there's other things to say about mindfulness, but I'll leave them until another time. And then another term that comes up in this context is introspective awareness, and that's sometimes called vigilance, another translation, vigilance. And in the Pali tradition, it's usually translated as clear comprehension. So if you're reading Pali texts or listening to teachers from the Theravada tradition, You might come across that term. So this also is explained in different ways. It's a little complicated. In the Sanskrit tradition, this term, introspective awareness, means meta-awareness that monitors and is aware of what is happening, especially in our mind. So it pays attention to our mind, and it's able to know if our mind is in a positive state or a negative, non-virtuous state. So, for example, sometimes we can notice in our mind that there are thoughts of criticalness. We're feeling critical of somebody, and having all these negative thoughts, criticizing them, judging them, and so on. So that's associated with anger, hatred, aversion. So if you become aware of those thoughts and you can recognize, oh, that's negative, that's non-virtuous, that's not a good way of thinking. So that's this mental factor that's doing that, noticing those negative thoughts and recognizing that they are negative thoughts. And on the other hand, when we have positive thoughts, for example, we notice that somebody is looking unhappy or experiencing some kind of difficulty, and we feel concern, compassion, and want to reach out and help them, start thinking about how we can help them. So those are positive thoughts. So when you have the awareness that that's what's going on in your mind and that those are positive, virtuous thoughts, then that is introspective awareness, doing that recognition. And introspective awareness is also aware of our body, what our body is doing. So this is a big part of the practice of mindfulness, especially in the Theravada tradition, paying attention to the different postures that our body is in, whether we're sitting, we're standing, we're walking, we're moving our arm, we're moving our leg, we're looking here, we're looking there, and so on. Just what our body is doing. And ideally, together with that awareness of what is correct and appropriate and ethical, as opposed to what is, not correct or not appropriate. And that's a big part of Dharma practice, is trying to refrain from doing actions that are harmful, unethical, disturbing to others, non-virtuous, and so forth, and trying to act in ways that are positive, beneficial, meaningful. But this is also something everybody has to practice. For example, when driving a car, you have to make sure that you're driving in the correct way, you're sitting in the correct way, you're looking at the right things and not at the wrong things, and not getting too involved in the conversation with the person in the car or on your phone. Otherwise, you may have an accident. So there's certain ways of behaving that we need to observe when we're driving a car or even walking down the street to ensure that we don't do any harm to ourselves and we don't do any harm to others. So this is introspective awareness, that is paying attention to what's going on with our body and also with our mind. So that's probably a lot of information there. We'll go through it again, but just to start explaining these terms. So as I mentioned before, there's 4 objects that are used in these practices, starting with the body. And with regard to the body, mindfulness of the body, there are different kinds of practices regarding the body. The first one is the breath. So this is something we've already been doing. You've already had experience of that. So let's stop at this point and spend some time doing this practice of mindfulness of the breath. And I thought it would be nice, it would be auspicious to read the actual words of the Buddha, what the Buddha advised with regard to this practice. So this is from the Satipatana Sutra, a very important sutra, especially in the Theravada tradition. It does exist in the Tibetan tradition as well, but it may not be so well known. So I'll just read the Buddha's words, Buddha's instructions on how to do mindfulness with regard to the breath. So here's the Buddha. He's talking to monks, but we can think he's talking to all of us. Whether a monk or nun or a layperson, it just means practitioners. And how, monks, does he, in regard to the body, abide contemplating the body? Here, gone to the forest, or to the root of a tree, or to an empty hut, he sits down, having folded his legs crosswise, set his body erect, and established mindfulness in front of him. Mindful he breathes in, mindful he breathes out. So he's advising us to find a quiet, conducive place for meditation. It would be hard to meditate in a shopping mall or a train station. So try to find a quiet place in the forest or in a house that's not too noisy and disruptive. And he says to sit cross-legged, but if you're not able to do that, it's perfectly fine to sit in a chair. But it is good to sit up straight. He does say here, set his body erect, because keeping the back straight does help the mind to be more focused. And then he says, established mindfulness in front of him. So there's different ways that that's explained, but Bhikkhu Analayo, who's the actual translator of this particular version of the sutra, and he also wrote a whole book explaining the four foundations of mindfulness. So the way he explained this expression in front of him, he says it means making it predominant, making it the main focus of his awareness. And I like that. I like that explanation. It makes more sense to me. Meaning that you sit down, put yourself in a good position, and then you decide to focus on mindfulness. You decide, I am going to practice mindfulness, and you're making that the most important thing you're doing at that moment in time. So you're putting aside other things, thinking about what you're going to cook for dinner, or who you're going to call, 1 hour later, and what you're going to say to them, and so on. So you're putting aside everything else and just making the practice of mindfulness your main practice at that moment in time. And then just being mindful of breathing in and breathing out. So let's do that for a few minutes. Make yourselves comfortable, sitting cross-legged or sitting in a chair. Trying to keep your back straight. You can have your eyes closed all the way. That's helpful for staying awake and alert. You can also keep them open a little bit. That helps to prevent sleepiness, drowsiness, whichever way is more comfortable for you. And then make this decision that for this period of time, you're going to mainly practice mindfulness of the breathing. You're going to make that your predominant activity and put aside everything else. All your plans for what you're going to do later, all your thoughts about past experiences. So you put everything else aside and just focus on this practice of mindfulness of the breath. And the Buddha didn't explain exactly how to be aware of the breath. So that's something you can explore and find what works best for you. The most important thing is to be aware of the breath. Each breath as it's coming in and going out. Now remember, the meaning of mindfulness is remembering the object, not forgetting the object and being distracted to something else. So at those moments when you are able to stay on the breath, you do have awareness of your breath coming in, going out. So at that moment, at those moments, mindfulness is active, mindfulness is present. So try to keep your mindfulness present and active as much as you can. And if you do notice your mind wandering away, distracted to something else, anything other than the breath, that means mindfulness has been lost. But you can regenerate it, you can renew it just by returning your attention to your breath and trying to keep it there as long as possible. So let's try this for 5 minutes. Okay, so going back to the text, where I left off, just read a bit more from there. So it's saying that the 4 establishments of mindfulness are cultivated on the basis of our body, feelings, mind, and phenomena, which are the main aspects of our experience. Our experience as human beings is mainly connected with these 4 objects. Body is the easiest one because it's quite coarse, easier to recognize, to notice, to experience. Feelings are more subtle. Mind is still more subtle. So we start with the more coarse or gross objects and then move to more subtle ones. And then it says, closely examining these 4 objects challenges our innate conceptions of who we are and how we exist, and at the same time helps us understand and release the grasping at I, which is at the center of our being. And Buddhism says this is our main problem. The root of all our problems, our difficulties, our suffering is grasping at mistaken, false sense of I, believing this I to exist in a very real, solid, concrete, inherently existing way, which it doesn't. And so we're mistaken about our whole sense of I, and then that mistake affects all of the other aspects of our experience. But of course, understanding selflessness, absence of self, is quite difficult. And the first of the 3 marks of existence is impermanence. That's not as subtle. That's easier to understand. And it's still very profound. I mean, by observing our body, our breath, our feelings, and so forth, we can get a first-hand experience of impermanence, how things are subject to change moment by moment, and they don't last. And that is very helpful. My own experiences, understanding impermanence and reminding myself of impermanence can really help with disturbing emotions, problems, conflicts, difficulties, challenges. Just reminding myself this whole thing is impermanent. It's not going to last. My mind is impermanent. My body is impermanent. The other person, whoever I'm having the problem with, they're impermanent too. Everything is impermanent. So just remembering that is very, very helpful. So here with this practice of the 4 establishments of mindfulness, we can get a first-hand experience of that impermanent nature of things. So then the text goes on to say, some Theravada teachers teach the 4 establishments of mindfulness, especially mindfulness of the breath, as a means to develop serenity, shamatha, and that's also known as calm abiding. So that's the ability to keep our mind focused on a single object for long periods of time. So this practice can be used to develop calm abiding. And other teachers teach it as a method leading to insight or vipassana. So that's the real meaning of vipassana, is insight or wisdom into the true nature of things. So this practice can be used in either ways or both ways. Training the mind to be continually mindful of the meditation object stabilizes and calms the mind, increasing concentration. Mindfulness also knows its object and its characteristics and qualities well, thus generating the understanding that leads to insight. So the practice of mindfulness can help both with concentration, learning to stay focused on object of our choice, but it also leads to insight, because we're paying very close attention to an object like our breath, like our body. And by doing that, we just naturally come to see how that object really exists, that it's impermanent, not permanent, that it's unsatisfactory and not absolutely wonderful and perfect, as we hope it would be, and so on. So then the introduction to the practice of mindfulness of the body, it says, we are embodied beings, and much of our life revolves around our bodies. Thus, the body is the first of the four objects to be examined. But as I mentioned just now, I think it's also easier to practice mindfulness of our body because it's just so obvious, so easy to focus on. Establishing mindfulness on the body brings a clear understanding of what the body is and what it means to have a body. So human beings do tend to have misunderstandings, misconceptions about the body. For example, thinking it's permanent when it's not. And you might say, no, I don't think my body's permanent. I know it's not going to last forever. But then how do we react when we notice changes in our body, especially the unwanted ones like wrinkles, age spots, hair turning gray? Our skin just isn't so smooth and beautiful as it was when we were younger. So I think people do tend to be unhappy and even distressed when these kind of changes happen to our body, which is like, well, what did you expect? Did you expect to have a 20-year-old body your whole life, and that it wasn't going to change? So what we think in our head and how we actually feel, our emotional responses to things can often there can be quite a big gap between them. So I think we do tend to not really see or understand the impermanent nature of our body, the fact that it's changing every minute, every second, getting older all the time, degenerating, and eventually dying. Because that's another thing too. We're so shocked when we hear about somebody dying. Like, so-and-so died. How could that happen? Again, like, what did you expect? They were going to be there forever? Especially when somebody's quite old. They're in their 90s or over 100. So, the shock is probably more sadness and a sense of loss and grief and so forth. But still, according to Buddhism, we really should think about impermanence. It's happening, and everyone is going to die. And if we could just make our mind more familiar with that, more acquainted with that, we wouldn't have so much shock and upsetness when changes do happen, when somebody does die. So if we look at our actual reactions to changes and things like death, we can see that we don't really take impermanence into account. We don't really see things in that way. So here it says, mindfulness investigates the body and sees that although it appears to the contrary, it is impermanent rather than permanent. It appears to be permanent. We don't see the changes happening moment by moment. They're so subtle we can't perceive them. But they are happening. These momentary changes happening every second or every nanosecond are what lead to the bigger changes that we do see, like the gray hairs and the wrinkles and the age spots. So those just didn't suddenly happen overnight, but there's been changes happening all along, even since we were born, that led to these more obvious changes. And secondly, it is not clean and attractive, although it appears to be. That's another kind of distorted conception we have, that the human body is just so wonderful and so pure and so perfect and so fantastic. But if we look more carefully at the body and what it's made of, that's one of the meditations we'll do later, the actual parts of the body, to see what the body's actually made of. And it can be hard to find something that's really wonderful and clean and pure in there. And then it cannot provide genuine happiness or pleasure. So this is another conception we tend to have, that, wow, having a body is so wonderful and so great and so fantastic. Yes, we can have pleasant experiences with our body, but those experiences are limited. They're like the first of the four kinds of happiness, sensory happinesses, and they don't last. They're short term, and they don't completely satisfy us. And then fourthly, it is not a self. Okay, so we can sometimes get this sense that this is me, this body is me, especially if somebody steps on our toes or brushes against us or nudges us or something. We may get very offended. How dare you treat me that way? How dare you do that to me? Some people get very upset about that. Maybe not you, but at those moments, that's what's happening. We're identifying with our body, feeling this is me, and you need to treat me in a certain way, in a respectful way. And if you don't, some people can even get into a rage about that. I once observed an incident like that. I was in an airport, having come off a flight, and I was at the baggage, what do they call it? Anyway, where you pick up your baggage. There's this thing that rolls around. So I was waiting there to get my baggage along with all the other passengers. And in front of me, there was a man and a woman. And the woman saw her suitcase coming and started reaching for it. And it was quite a big, heavy suitcase. So as she picked up the suitcase off the trolley, or whatever that thing is called, the belt, that's it, the belt, she kind of, lost her balance and kind of brushed against the man next to her. And he got so angry. I didn't hear what he said, but judging by his face and his body language and the way she reacted, I think he said something quite nasty to her. And then she, in turn, got upset and said something nasty to him. And so both of them were really angry at each other. And I thought, how sad that is. Just such a small thing, just brushing. She didn't do it deliberately. It's because her suitcase was too heavy. And he could have helped her. That would have been the right thing to do, to say, oh, she's quite small and that suitcase is quite big. I will help her. But anyway, so that's just one example of how people can get so upset, so outraged if something happens to their body. Somebody touches their body in a way other than they want. So anyway, we have lots of attitudes about our bodies that can lead to suffering and problems, both for ourselves and for other people. So mindfulness of the body can help us to see our body in a more realistic way and free ourselves from these unrealistic and sometimes harmful attitudes. So we've run out of time. We'll stop there for today and continue next week. And it would be good if you can to continue doing this practice of mindfulness of the breath, even if it's just a few minutes a day before we meet again next week, because we'll go on and add to that practice, build on it, do additional things. And if you have any questions, you can email them to me. I'll try to answer them in the next class. So let's just take a few minutes to mentally dedicate the positive energy of this session, coming together with a positive motivation, listening to these teachings and thinking about them, practicing them, trying to understand them. So we've created some good energy, positive energy, which is the cause of happiness and spiritual growth. And let's share this positive energy with the wish that all living beings can receive benefit, be free of their suffering and causes of suffering, and achieve genuine happiness and its causes. Okay, thank you. See you next week.